You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City, and I'm joined today by a special guest, but a familiar face on the show. We're very glad to have Aman Tucker back on the show. Aman, how's it going today?
Good, Ankit. Thanks so much for having me back on.
Pleasure to have you. So Aman, for listeners who might not know, was a writer for the Diplomat South Asia section. He still contributes occasionally. But Aman, tell us a little bit about what you're working on these days.
Sure. So I'm currently wrapping up my master's at the University of Oxford. I'm at St. Anthony's College here. I'm trying to understand how we can apply the concept of grand strategy to India, which is going to be my thesis while I'm here. I'm also simultaneously an adjunct fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies with the Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies there to focus a lot of work on the U.S.-India strategic relationship and on India's domestic reform agenda. So that's sort of where my research interests lie.
Perfect. Well, that's all great, and I'm really happy to have you on the show today. As listeners can probably tell, based on Aman's biography, what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, U.S. President Donald Trump's first visit to India. Trump becomes the fourth consecutive U.S. president to visit New Delhi and Ahmedabad in this case, the home state, the capital of the home state of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Gujarat. And there's a lot to talk about. The visit was really, I think people had many different expectations. You had sort of the more skeptical crowd that expected Trump to potentially commit some kind of major gaffe and potentially reveal the fissures that are really underlying the U.S.-India relationship today. And then the more optimistic crowd that expected things to really remain on the rails. And I'd say we ended up somewhere in between, probably a little bit more towards what the optimists were expecting. I mean, we'll take stock of the overall visit, but I think it's also important to contextualize it on the U.S. side, at least for Trump. I mean, this is the first major overseas trip that the U.S. president's gone on since he survived a very acrimonious impeachment trial. Certainly, President Trump and his base are looking forward to a general election later this year in November, and many of the visuals that came out of this India trip, I think, are going to be part of President Trump sort of presenting himself as a global statesman. Certainly, I think we saw that in the president's own Twitter feed. While he was in India, they published a video of the event that occurred on the first day of his visit on Monday when he spoke to a crowd of over 100,000 in a cricket stadium in Ahmedabad at an event called Namaste Trump, which was, of course, India's reciprocity for the Howdy Modi event that took place in September 2019 during Narendra Modi's trip to the United States for the UN. Of course, that event, the Howdy Modi event in the U.S., was hosted by an Indian-American organization, whereas Namaste Trump was reciprocated officially by the Indian government. But maybe, Aman, before we get into the nitty gritty of the discussions and talk about defense and trade and all of the ins and outs of, the nuts and bolts of the U.S.-India relationship, what are your sort of overall expectations? I mean, do you think my assessment is sort of fair that we basically ended up on the more optimistic side of things, or do you have a different assessment of how the trip went?
I mean, I agree with you, and I think that we definitely ended up on the optimistic side of things. But I think it's fair to say that the optimistic side of things, the bar was set kind of low for this trip. I mean, no gaffe. After there was no trade deal. It was just, I saw some people saying that just Trump getting on the flight and committing himself to a 15-hour flight to Ahmedabad was a major deliverable. I mean, I'm careful here because there is a discussion within sort of the policy space about are we putting too many expectations on the U.S.-India relationship, and are we expecting too much out of India at a place when it can't deliver? But I do think that, when we were talking about what sort of the optimist vision is of this trip, it was sort of like, okay, he won't bring up anything that embarrasses India. He won't sort of, he won't have a gaffe. That's a bit of a low bar, and I sort of recognize that, this trip was, after the trade deal fell apart, mostly high on optics. And in that sense, both sides walked away with a lot to take back to their constituencies.
Right, right. And I think the optics, when it comes to summits like these, you usually want to have a couple deliverables. And I'd say they mostly did that. Trump gave a speech that really any of his predecessors, going back to George W. Bush, could have given in India. He stayed on the teleprompter during the Namaste Trump speech. I mean, again, very low bar here, but it's never a given that Donald Trump will actually, stick to his teleprompter remarks.
Right.
I mean, he delivered a speech that included, included references even to India's pluralistic and syncretic religious traditions, which I thought was quite interesting. You wouldn't really expect that from Trump. I mean, we can, for example, recall his speech in 27 in Warsaw, Poland, where he very much took a clash of civilizations message, and then yet again, here he is in India, as of course, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but of course, very unfortunately coinciding with Trump's trip to India, New Delhi, the Indian capital, saw some of the most intense Hindu on Muslim violence that's been seen in the capital in decades. But
Right.
coming at that time, Trump delivered this speech that was sort of surprising. I mean, it was surprising to me that that was included in Trump's speech. You never know with his overseas remarks. He's really kind of run the gamut between taking a very kind of blood and soil nationalism, America first message overseas. But here it was a very conventional speech in many ways. And other people were also taken aback by the fact that the president directly mentioned, for example, the Quadrilateral Initiative with Japan, Australia, alongside India and the U.S. As far as I know, that's the first time President Trump's directly included that in a speech. So I think some observers took that as a sign that the relevance of India in the broader U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy continues to be quite high. But yeah, I mean, I think on the Indian side, certainly I think India will view this trip as largely successful. If you look at the broader story of U.S.-India relations going back at least 15 years to 2005 and the nuclear deal, but maybe going back even to 2000, the trend line remains positively linear, right? I mean, things remain on track. Of course, there are, I think, structural concerns in the U.S.-India relationship. I mean, so trade is actually, I think, one of the more familiar irritants in the U.S.-India relationship, right? It's an irritant in a different way under the Trump administration, but certainly previous administrations have also struggled with India on trade issues. We have some new issues, including India's decision to sit out the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. But certainly trade disputes aren't a new thing. But maybe let's talk a little bit about trade. I mean, we had some reports before the summit that Robert Lighthizer was supposed to go to India. He didn't go, and then sort of the trade deal fell apart. But the joint statement between Trump and Modi indicated that they would work towards a phase one deal, eventually leading to a comprehensive trade deal. So what's your sense on the state of play right now between the U.S. and India on trade?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, it's definitely one of those things that has become a major point in this relationship. I mean, if you look at, as you were saying, it's always been an issue, but with this president in particular and his focus on both the U.S.'s global trade deficit and with specific partners that he thinks are so-called ripping us off, he's sort of taken a laser focus on the deficit. In India, one of the few countries, I mean, it also has a massive deficit with the world. But India, one of the countries that actually has a surplus, is with the United States. And so that's become a big sort of flashpoint. And both sides have really taken their fair share of protectionist measures. India under Prime Minister Modi has really, when he came into office, the consensus really was that he might continue India's, liberalization that has been going on since 1991, but really actively, at least since 2017-18, the prime minister and his government have been steadily increasing tariffs. If you go back to the budget announcement this year, earlier this month, this is the fourth time, I think, that this government has raised tariffs. So did it once in the 2017 budget, did it once again in September 2017. In response to GSP, they raised tariffs against the U.S., and now again for a fourth time. So that's a really sort of worrying trend on the Indian side of, continuously raising tariffs after over 20 years of liberalization. And then on the U.S. side too, I mean, steel and aluminum, that's something where the president of the United States singled out much, the rest of the world really, but in those industries really hit out on India, taking away the generalized system of preferences, which is this sort of one-way benefit that the United States offers to developing countries. To allow them to grow, taking away those benefits. And India was, in fact, the largest beneficiary under that program. And so, both sides have really taken their fair share of protectionist steps. And this was really a moment to try and resolve some of those differences. We had one moment earlier when, as you said, the Prime Minister went to the United States in September, and there was a similar rush to get a deal signed. And I know Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal actually made a trip out to the United States. That didn't work out. Then they said, okay, we'll try again when President Trump goes to India. Again, Lighthizer was supposed to go out, canceled his trip because of the differences that ended up. And I mean, depending on who you talk to in India, they were actually really close to a deal. I'm hearing things that India actually caved on agriculture, and actually the differences emerged on a lot of the digital space issues. India's new regulations on e-commerce, making it more difficult for foreign e-commerce companies to work, as well as data localization issues were really the sticking point. Whereas agriculture, which has been the traditional issue, it was actually maybe possible that India was willing to make a concession there in order to reach some kind of a phase one deal. So I don't know, after two times going in this go around, whether a third time a deal can be reached. I don't know if there's a summit anytime else in the future. So, getting that kind of momentum going again when there's a leader level summit, that's an opportunity you don't want to lose. And having lost it twice, the thing that I take away from it is, these are really much more intractable issues. And so I guess the main hope is now that the policy steps that we've taken don't start to bleed over into the actual trade, which has surprisingly been growing. 5% growth in US-India trade over the last year, despite all of these steps being taken. But at some point, you have to imagine that the policy steps will leak over and affect actual day-to-day trade, and that's what we don't want to see happen.
Right. Yeah, and I think this language in the joint statement of a phased deal and a comprehensive deal, kind of similar to the China playbook, really, I think suggests that they're going to end up dividing this issue up. I mean, I've heard the same thing as you have about the proximity to a deal. So hopefully they will be able to conclude a deal on some of the lower hanging fruit issues, or at least the issues where India's already caved to U.S. demands, and then where India really has red lines, I think that will take much longer. And it's actually, that deal might not even happen before the U.S. election. So again, I think there's a lot of uncertainty there for India as well. So, one of the major differences between Trump's trip to India and the other presidential visits to India by U.S. presidents since 2000 is, of course, this major public event where Trump spoke to, over 100,000 people. What'd you make of the Namaste Trump event? I mean, I already shared a little bit about what I thought, but I'd love to hear your kind of overall impression of that event and what you think it did for, I guess, what it did for Trump and what it did for Modi.
Yeah, I mean, this event was really, I think, important for two reasons. One was, I think, to highlight the personal chemistry that these leaders have and that they want to project to the world. So, following the Howdy Modi event in Texas, the prime minister saying, this is a friend of mine, I want to reciprocate and have him speak to my home state in where he sort of got his political career, sort of catapulted into national sort of his national sort of career. That's sort of, a good deliverable for him to give to what he would consider a personal friend or, a friend on the world stage. And that's something that, you really saw highlighted in both of their remarks to the public, to the attendees in the audience. But I think also a big sort of important symbol was for the people-to-people ties. Gujarat, I think the statistics were that 1/3 of all Indian immigrants to the U.S. find some trace or route to Gujarat. And so highlighting those people-to-people ties, the fact that the U.S. and India are having this long-standing relationship of people that go over there, find some success, or even in U.S. businesses increasingly coming over. The last statistics that I read is that 1 million people in India are employed by some U.S. business. So highlighting those people-to-people ties are also, I think, a really important step, and that's something that came out of this event. But really, I mean, this was a great thing to do for the optics of the event. I mean, once you sort of look away that you don't have a trade deal, and we can talk about some of the deliverables that came out of the meeting, but this is really sort of the thing that they were billing as going to be the most important centerpiece of the visit. And in that sense, I mean, it was it reached the mark. It actually exceeded expectations. I mean, people sort of walk away from this knowing that at least India can walk away from this knowing that this event went off without a hitch. The president felt very welcome. He got to see the Taj Mahal. He got to go to the Sabarmati Ashram. He got to address a big crowd, which he loves to do and has spent a lot of his term in office doing. That's where he sort of feels at home. And so really in that sense, it is a good takeaway to take home. But it really from my sense, it does something for the relationship, but without substance, you really can't just depend on events like this to drive the relationship forward.
Right.
This can carry you forward for a little bit, and you can do something at a time when you can't reach a trade deal and you haven't got much else in the deliverable pipeline. But we can't revert to sort of just doing big events and not really having the substance to actually make this, as both sides call it, a global strategic partnership.
Right.
That's something that we're still waiting to see how both sides can come to this and do things that make this relationship go forward.
Yeah, no, I think the crowd size issue I think is actually quite important. I mean, Trump was expecting 7 million people, which is larger than the population of Ahmedabad. But certainly for a president that, if we think back to the beginning of Trump's presidential term, we spent the first week of his presidency talking about his inauguration crowd size, right? So the fact that India was able to deliver 100,000 people plus, I think actually did actually leave Trump feeling quite satisfied. He talked about how well he was received in India. No one should tell him that Eisenhower once addressed a crowd of 500,000 in India. And when India had a much smaller population, but
when Henry Madan tweeted that out, I was like, oh no, don't let him see that, because the moment he sees 500,000, he's gonna want that himself.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, also for India, I mean, I have to say, like for New Delhi, it seems like right now, with everything that India is doing since the last general election, the May 2019 general election. All the internal overhaul that's been happening with Kashmir, the Citizenship Act, the internal instability in Assam and the Northeast. And of course, we're actually doing we're taping this podcast on the 1-year anniversary of the Balakot strikes. Trump actually did reference, stability in South Asia being a goal. For India, in many ways, it's less about moving the relationship with the U.S. forward in a measurable way, but it's more about managing Trump and sort of keeping a lid on things, right? I mean, even if we talk about the personal chemistry between Modi and Trump, and it was positive, right? I mean, you can just ask, Shinzo Abe and Xi Jinping, I mean, how far personal chemistry with Trump goes, or even Kim Jong-un, right? So, I mean, ultimately, personal chemistry does help. But really, I think for India right now, the goal is to keep the U.S. on India's side in a way that can actually help India manage its internal affairs and its neighborhood on its own terms with U.S. support, right? So last year, I mean, the U.S. was quite supportive of India during the Balakot strikes, basically with former National Security Advisor John Bolton speaking to his Indian counterpart, Ajit Doval, and, giving kind of the U.S.'s assent to whatever India was going to do, in the readout from MEA. Bolton was reported to have said that, the U.S. recognizes India's right to self-defense. So those sorts of issues, I think, are really at the top of the Indian agenda in the short term. But, that being said, let's talk a little bit about geopolitics and I guess the big deliverable, which is this one defense deal that's come out of the trip for a set of military helicopters amounting to $3 billion, along with other equipment. Geopolitically, of course, there's, I think, a big backdrop to Trump's trip to Asia, to South Asia at this point, which is the impending deal in a few days with the Afghan Taliban. Right now, we're in a cessation of hostilities that's supposed to lead to a signing of the deal on Leap Day on February 29th. And certainly, I think within that context, his trip to India becomes quite apparent. And of course, he actually had some pretty, he spoke about Pakistan both at his at the Namaste Trump event and during his press conference with Modi on the second day. And he wasn't necessarily acerbic or particularly bitter. He talked about, the relationship with Pakistan is quite good, and we're working on sort of cracking down on terrorist organizations and militants that operate on the Pakistani border. Of course, that's, music to Indian ears, saying that, an American president saying that in New Delhi. But broadly speaking, I think that context really merits a focus here. I think the Trump administration has made it clear that it would like to see India play a more proactive role in South Asian security, including in Afghanistan. So what did you make of the sort of geopolitical and defense deliverables out of this trip?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good context to sort of have, because, you are right that this trip came in at sort of a particularly interesting time when they announced this deal. So yeah, first on the helicopters, I mean, this again signals about how India is increasingly moving. I mean, it understands what Trump wants, right? It's stadium crowds and defense deals. And so you're right that in the sense of managing sort of the personality that comes with President Trump's administration, they figured out what it is that the administration and particularly the president likes to see come out of these events, out of these summits, and they teed it up perfectly for him in the sense of giving him a big stadium spectacle, then taking him to Delhi and saying, we're going to buy $3 billion in equipment. But I think also it makes sense for India to invest in these. I mean, these are helicopters To speak tactically, I mean these are anti-sub helicopters, which again signal India's growing interest in playing this role in the Indian Ocean and increasing skepticism of the one country that we know is having sub operations in the Indian Ocean, which is China. So that's again something that signals quietly to the rest of us how India is shaping up and purchasing equipment that would make it more ready going into going into a changing geopolitical environment in the Indian Ocean. But again, going now from maritime to continental, I mean, this is something that Afghanistan, India has been working and grappling with, and that's something that I've been trying to study up here. And for readers that haven't already read this book, but I just started Avinash Paliwal's great book, My Enemy's Enemy, which talks about the history of Indian relations with Afghanistan and particularly the intelligence relationship the two of them have. But I thought it was very interesting, that President Trump said that he had the press conference afterwards, after the joint statement. He had the solo press conference that he gave and said, one of those things where we want India to play a bigger role in Afghanistan. We want, we've done enough. We fought ISIS and we've killed Baghdadi. So, India can take a bigger role here in South Asia. When he was asked a question about cross-border terrorism. And here I kind of sometimes agree with the stance that Siraj Mohan has about when he puts out his op-eds on India's Afghanistan policy, which is that we have to be able to deal with changing requirements of the great power. When the United States no longer wants to make a commitment to Afghanistan and it's important to our security, India will have to step up and figure out how it's going to deal with the vacuum. It was never, it was the fact that the United States is here should not be taken as a granted. They were always going to leave at some point or the other. And this president, he wants to get these troops home, even if it means that it will affect the situation on the ground. You've seen that in Syria. You've seen that in Iraq. He doesn't have a particular penchant of, caring about what the situation looks like after he's gone, as long as he gets the troops home and he can tell his base that he's ending the wars that he promised he would end. So how India starts to respond to this is, really going to require a mentality shift, which is, okay, something that we've taken for granted that the United States is going to be here and is going to ensure that we leave Afghanistan more stable and make sure that there's a strategy in place for the government to govern after they're gone. Right now, that may not happen, and that affects India's security. And so India has to figure out how that happens. I think we'll have to wait and see what comes out of this and what India decides to do. But, it is sort of something that India increasingly has to grapple with, especially under this administration. And if we can be frank, throwing their lot in with Trump, I mean, we can talk about, again, the bipartisan consensus. But, as you said, they're very happy to engage Trump on these issues as long as he doesn't say anything about what's going on within India's borders. And he's been very happy not to say anything about Kashmir, not to say anything about CAA, not to say anything about the protests. And so they seem to have thrown in their lot with him and hoping, Abki Bar Trump Sarkar, that he comes back to office. If that's the case, well, they also have to grapple with the downside of it, which is that he may not do what they want on Afghanistan, and they have to figure out what their strategy looks like.
Right. No, actually, so that's a perfect segue. And for listeners, by the way, if you're interested in the Afghanistan situation, we do have another podcast scheduled for later this week, potentially releasing next week, on the nitty-gritty of how we got to this deal with the Taliban. Of course, the deal hasn't happened yet. Still questions about whether it will materialize. Of course, a lot can happen in, I guess, the 72 hours that remain before the leap day deadline from the time we're recording this. But yeah, actually, Aman, that is where I want to end, on kind of the fraying bipartisan consensus, as you put it. So a feature of the U.S.-India relationship, going back at least 15 years, even a little longer, has been the very strong and rather immovable bipartisan consensus until recently. And of course, a lot of the risk-taking that India has been doing internally, certainly in 2019, big year of risk-taking from everything from the anti-satellite test to the Balakot strikes to the changing of Kashmir's status internally to the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens implementation in Assam. All of that together, I think, has created a picture of India that is starting to permeate parts of the American political establishment, certainly the Democratic side of the aisle, where there is a greater concern about issues like human rights, right? So obviously Trump, I think it's very natural that Trump wouldn't say anything about these things. I mean, he's been happy to talk to the Philippines and not talk about Duterte's drug war and extrajudicial killings. So hard for me to imagine him taking an interest in many of these issues in India, especially given the perception of the Modi government and the RSS, the parent organization of the BJP, sort of leveraging Hindu nationalist forces to take on Muslims. We can, of course, talk about President Trump's own perceived animus towards Muslims. And, it's really not something that the administration in the United States has given a lot of attention to, unless, it's sort of being opportunistic and talking about China and Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, of course, which I think is the exception there. But yeah, when it comes to India, that's really, the context. It doesn't get more stark with Trump being in New Delhi, sort of shaking hands with Modi, the Namaste Trump event happening in Ahmedabad, and of course at the same time you have these massive communal riots, horrifying images coming out of New Delhi of mosques being put under siege. This all raises questions. As you said, India seems to be making a bet that Trump will be reelected, and India will continue to enjoy a continuing upward trajectory with the United States, sort of a continued recognition of its indispensability in the Indo-Pacific region as a counterbalance to China. And the United States will say nothing about Indian internal issues, including Kashmir and the treatment of Muslims. If a Democrat is elected, and right now it looks like the frontrunner is on the left side of the party's flank, Bernie Sanders, many of Bernie Sanders' surrogates in Congress, including Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, have actually been quite vocally critical of the Modi government on many of these issues. If Bernie Sanders wins, for example, in November, that's a very different kind of expectation that New Delhi has to prepare for. So it's a dangerous bet, and it's certainly not the kind of bet that previous Indian governments have been willing to make. The previous Indian governments haven't been willing to take the kind of risks that the Modi 2.0 administration has. Certainly, I think even if we look at the 2014 iteration of the Modi government, the narrative was quite different. This was Modi being elected as sort of being given the benefit of the doubt by the West in many ways, that even despite his legacy in Gujarat, including his complicity or refusal to condemn the violence in 2002, that Modi would focus on economic revitalization. And that appeared to be true for a bit, but now it seems like the party is doubling down on Hindu nationalism as economic indicators start to flag. So what's your assessment of what we can look forward to in the U.S.-India relationship?
Yeah, first of all, we can start with the violence in Delhi. It's one of the most disturbing and horrifying acts of violence that we've seen. Some of the videos coming out of people going up on mosques and pulling down the loudspeaker and putting up saffron flags or Indian flags, and the videos that have come out of police officers sometimes being complicit, sometimes standing by while people you immediately start judging people that look like Muslims or asking them to say whether they're Muslim or not. It's very sad to see as someone who's an Indian citizen and that happening in Delhi. And it's hard not to draw the line. You can say whatever you want about how this started or who's to blame for it, but it's hard for me to not draw the line between statements that are said by BJP leaders the day before violence comes out and then the next day violence happens. That happened with Anurag Thakur going out and making a speech about, shoot the traitors, Goli Malo Sarko, all of that stuff. And then the next day, a man with a gun shows up and the police stands idly by while he shoots someone in the crowd. One day before the violence began in Delhi, Kapil Mishra of the BJP goes out and says, let's teach them a lesson. Let's go out there and show them what we are. And then the violence begins. You can find some convoluted reasons about why the BJP is not to blame for this, but Occam's razor always holds that when these leaders speak, they have to take ownership of their words. But going, from what's happening right in the local of Delhi to the bipartisan relationship, this is absolutely right. You saw, I think Elizabeth Warren was the first one that made a statement about the violence in Delhi last night as President Trump, was mid-flight back from India. You've seen Bernie Sanders not be afraid. He, when President Trump was giving his speech, he put out a tweet saying we should be working with India on climate change and not on defense deals, and has made wrote an op-ed for the Houston Chronicle while Howdy Modi was happening, talking about the shutdown in Kashmir and calling for that to end. So you have seen, and this is not as people in India would say, they might complain that this is, the great power, the great policeman coming and telling us how to run the internal affairs of a country. We've had we don't want white people telling us how to run our country. And fair point that India has a history of and a legitimate fear of what happens when people lecture to them and complain to them. But this is not what this is. This is a friendship and a partnership that India and the United States both have entered into. And it's the job of friends to tell them when things aren't going right. And that's what one side of the aisle seems to be doing. That, it's not just about Western values or just about, American being a policeman saying that communications lockdown shouldn't happen in Kashmir. It's the wrong thing to do. You shouldn't lock down 6 million people in Kashmir and deny them internet access. You shouldn't be locking up politicians and detaining them and putting draconian laws such as the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And you shouldn't be passing legislation that fast tracks citizenship for all but one specific religious community. Those are all not upholding the liberal values that India claims to proclaim on the world stage. And not to self-promote, but that's something that, my last piece with The Diplomat was about that. The Prime Minister Modi has gone around the world, especially in his speeches about foreign policy, and directly himself drawn the line that we uphold freedom, openness, and inclusivity at home. So it's time to uphold a liberal international order that is free, open, and inclusive, especially creating a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And there's two choices. One, that India has to come out and say, we don't believe in these values anymore, in which case, that has its own can of worms because a big part of the US-India relationship is built on shared values. Or we start to put, those values in action at home. And that's something, the latter is what I think that the government should move towards. And if you have a commitment to those values, it's only right that the entire American establishment, but as of right now, at least one wing of the American establishment tells you to, or asks you to uphold those values. And I think risking the U.S.-India relationship by saying, we'll just work with the side of the American political establishment that doesn't care about values so that we can continue to do what we want inside and have a strategic partnership on the outside, that's a bet that you can make. But as you said, that's a very risky bet. And India needs to play out how the scenario goes through, because it's not unlikely that a Sanders presidency is possible. It's not unlikely that Elizabeth Warren becomes president. It's not unlikely that Joe Biden becomes president. And I think all of these people will care about what India does internally and ask it that it upholds its values that it proclaims outside of India, within India. And so I don't think this is even about the U.S.-India relationship to an extent, but about what India should be doing, and the very important foil that India has to China in Asia. That, one of the things that I pointed out is this is giving free ammunition to China. You've seen, Chinese outlets are talking about why they can defend their actions in Xinjiang because of what India is doing in terms of internet lockdowns and internet shutdowns in Kashmir. And I really, as someone who's an Indian citizen and someone who cares about seeing India's place in the world, I don't want to see that comparison being made. And we're just handing ammunition over to detractors of the free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific vision. And so, that's just something that I think India should be more responsive to, should recognize that this is the concern of a friend and a partnership that they've invested 15 to 20 years in, and not just what they think is, a Western country telling them how to run things.
Right. Yeah. And I think, there is the potential for domestic politics in India to also play a role here. I mean, maybe this is a little too optimistic, but I mean, one of the most powerful political forces in India tends to be anti-incumbency, especially when the economy is not doing too well. And despite of course, the BJP put up an incredible result in the general elections last year. But if you look at the regional picture, regional parties, state parties are beginning to push back. Of course, India doesn't have a national opposition really to speak of in the form of the Congress Party. But, I've learned that it's best not to treat Indian politics as too predictable. I mean, yes, the next general election is still 4 years away. But I think if current trends continue, it's not necessarily a given also that the BJP will be able to maintain the sort of dominance that it's enjoyed for the last year or so. So things are, I think, going to be in flux. But certainly I think the U.S.-India relationship is opening an interesting new chapter. And I think that's going to be true even if Trump is reelected. India is for better or worse, India is throwing its weight around more than it has in the past in the Indo-Pacific region, in its relationship with the United States, and I think that is manifesting in some really interesting ways. So, yeah, no, I think you've sort of put things really well. We're gonna have to really keep an eye on this and see where things go, especially later this year with the U.S. elections. Anyways, Aman, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. But thanks a lot for making the time to join me on the podcast today to talk about the U.S.-India relationship.
No, thanks for having me on. This was great. Thanks for all your questions, and hope listeners take away something from this.
Great. So for our listeners, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or any other number of podcast providers out there. And if you have been a listener for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. We really appreciate that. It also helps new people find the show. So please do leave us a review. We really do appreciate those. And finally, before we close, a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.